The dog was already dying when Grant found her. She was wedged beneath the collapsed porch of an abandoned farmhouse outside of Nanton, Alberta, a cattle dog mix, ribs showing through a coat matted with mud and burrs, one hind leg bent at a wrong angle. It was February, -23. Grant had only stopped because his truck slid on black ice, and he'd stepped out to check the front tire, and some sound he couldn't identify, lower than a whimper, more like pressure releasing from a cracked pipe, had made him walk around the side of the house instead of getting back in the cab. He almost missed her entirely. If the wind had been blowing the other direction, he would have. That was 3 years ago. Grant was 58 years old, 14 months out of a marriage that had dissolved the way most things dissolve, slowly, then all at once. He had no dog. He had no plan to get one. He had a 1994 Dodge pickup with a cracked defrost and a half-finished basement Reno he kept intending to complete. He worked contract security for an industrial site in Okotoks and drove the hour each way without music because he'd stopped being able to tolerate music somewhere around the time his son stopped calling. He wasn't a man who talked about himself. Navy guys rarely are. Not the real ones, not the ones who went to the places Grant went. 22 years in the service, 8 of those with Kansofcom, attached to joint task forces, he still couldn't fully describe to civilian acquaintances without watching their eyes either widen or glaze. He'd come home from his last deployment to find a wife who had learned, in his absence, how to be alone. Turns out that's a skill you can't unlearn. He understood. He didn't say he understood. He just moved into the downstairs and started on the basement and let the thing unspool the way it needed to. The dog's name, he would later decide, was Biscuit. He didn't know why. It came to him in the truck on the way to the emergency vet in High River, the dog wrapped in the emergency blanket he kept behind his seat, her head resting across his thigh with a trust she had absolutely no reason to extend. She was shaking. He kept his right hand on her side, feeling her breathe. "You're okay," he said. He hadn't spoken out loud in 2 days. He didn't know, in that moment, whether he was telling the truth. The vet on call that night was a young woman named Dr. Tesaro, and she did not give Grant much hope. The leg was fractured in 2 places. There was evidence of prolonged malnutrition. The dog's temperature was critically low, and there was bruising along her right flank, consistent with a kick or a blow. Something deliberate, not accidental. Dr. Tesaro said she wanted to be honest with him, even with treatment, even if they could stabilize her. There might be neurological effects from the cold exposure. There might be permanent lameness. There might be a surgery bill that exceeded what most people were willing to spend on a dog they'd owned for less than 2 hours. Grant looked at Biscuit on the exam table. Biscuit looked back at him. "Do what you need to do," he said. He drove home and sat in the dark kitchen and drank 3 fingers of rye whiskey and did not think about the money, because the money was fine. It was one of the few things that was fine, and thought instead about his last working dog. A Belgian Malinois named Axis, who'd been partnered with a handler named Corporal Lefebvre until Lefebvre was medically discharged, and then repartnered with Grant for the last 2 years of their deployments. Axis had the kind of focus that made civilian dogs look like they were living on a different planet. He worked with a precision that Grant recognized as something close to professional pride. When the mission ended, he went into the harness, and when the mission ended, he came out of the harness, and he was a different animal in each. Axis had died at 11 years old in a kennel facility in Petawawa, and Grant had not been present and had received the information in a 2-line email, and had sat in his truck for 40 minutes in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Okotoks and not been able to explain, even to himself, why the news hit the way it did. It wasn't just the dog. It never is, with those dogs. It was everything the dog represented. The precision, the purpose, the clean vocabulary of a task completed correctly. The world made sense in that framework. Grant had spent the better part of a decade since trying to locate something that made sense in the same way and had not yet found it. He poured a 4th finger and went to bed. Dr. Tesaro called the next morning at 7:45. Biscuit had made it through the night. Grant drove back to High River and sat in the waiting room with a paper cup of bad coffee, and watched a family with 2 small kids wait for news on a rabbit. The kids were using their inside voices, barely. Their father kept putting his hands on their shoulders like he was trying to ground them. Grant thought, not for the first time, that the ability to love something small and fragile and totally dependent was one of the stranger capacities humans had developed. He wasn't sure he'd ever had it in full. His ex-wife, Carolyn, had said once, not cruelly, which made it land harder, that Grant showed up best in emergencies, that he was built for crisis and uncomfortable in the absence of it, that she'd spent 15 years waiting for him to find a way to be present in ordinary time, and had finally understood it wasn't going to happen. He'd wanted to argue with her. He hadn't been able to. Dr. Tesoro came out around 9 and told him the surgery had gone well. The leg would require a plate. Biscuit would need 6 to 8 weeks of restricted movement, daily medications, careful management of her diet and hydration. She would walk again. Whether she'd run was harder to say. How long was she out there, do you think? Grant asked. Dr. Tesoro shook her head. Days at minimum. Maybe longer. She's estimated 3 to 4 years old. Someone owned her at some point. She's been spayed. She knows basic commands. Someone put something happened. She paused. These things are hard to know. Grant nodded. He understood that things happen that are hard to know. I'm going to need a name for the file, Dr. Tesoro said. Pen ready? Biscuit, Grant said. She wrote it down without comment, which he appreciated. The first week he drove to High River every day after his shift, 40 minutes each way on top of the hour commute, which meant he was in his truck for close to 4 hours a day. But the shifts were 12-hour days and he was used to operating, tired, and the driving gave him something to do with his hands and eyes that wasn't the basement or the whiskey or the particular quality of silence that gathered in the house after dark. He sat with Biscuit in the recovery area and talked to her. He had not been a man who talked to dogs before. He became one. He talked about the weather, genuinely, not as filler, because weather in southern Alberta in February is a legitimate topic of ongoing concern. He talked about the basement, the drywall he was planning to put up, the question of whether he needed a second sump pump given the drainage issues he'd noticed in the spring. He talked, once, about access, which surprised him enough that he stopped mid-sentence and looked at the wall for a moment. Biscuit watched him the whole time with a focused attention that he found, inexplicably, easier to receive than the attention of most people he knew. You're a good listener, he told her. She thumped her tail twice against the blanket. Don't let it go to your head. His daughter, Laurel, called the second week. She lived in Vancouver, taught high school English, had 2 kids of her own, and a husband named Patrick who worked in urban planning, and who Grant had a perfectly neutral relationship with. Not warm, not difficult, just the cordial distance of 2 people who have chosen the same woman's company for entirely different reasons. Laurel checked in on him every few weeks. The calls were careful, affectionate in a guarded way, both of them navigating around the things they didn't say. She asked how he was doing. I found a dog, he said. A pause. You found a dog? Under a porch in Nanton. She's at the vet in High River. Broken leg, malnutrition. She's going to be okay. Another pause. Longer. Dad, she needed someone, Dad. You've been saying for years you don't want a dog. I've been wrong about other things. He heard her exhale, the sound of someone recalibrating. Then something else in her voice, something that might have been relief. What's her name? Biscuit. Biscuit. A beat. That's a good name. I thought so. Will you send me a picture? He said he would. He actually did it, which he recognized later was notable. He was not someone who reliably followed through on small personal requests. He found Dr. Tesoro's assistant, a teenager named Cody who'd been feeding Biscuit her evening meal, and asked if he could borrow the phone for a minute. Cody showed him how to send it. He sent Laurel a picture of Biscuit looking directly at the camera, one ear up and one ear sideways, cone around her neck, looking, Grant thought, somewhat put out but fundamentally dignified. Laurel sent back a heart. He stared at it for longer than he would admit. Biscuit came home at the end of February. Grant had done his research. He'd bought a crate large enough for her to stand and turn, a orthopedic mat, a slow feeder bowl, the specific kibble the vet had recommended. He'd bought 2 different types of puzzle toys and a selection of chews after reading 3 separate forum threads about post-surgical dog enrichment, which was a sentence he would not have imagined constructing 4 weeks earlier. He had child-gated the stairs because the vet said no stairs. He had rearranged the living room furniture so there was a clear, uncarpeted path from the crate to the back door for bathroom trips. He had watched 4 instructional videos on canine rehabilitation exercises. The industrial site manager, a blunt and practical man named Kowalski, had not been thrilled when Grant asked about modifying his schedule. Grant explained briefly. Kowalski said, "You found a broken dog under a porch?" Grant said yes. Kowalski said nothing for a few seconds. Then he said, "My sister's got a 3-legged shepherd. Sweetest dog you ever met." He approved the schedule change. That first night, Biscuit slept in her crate in the living room. Grant slept on the couch because the recovery instructions said she might be disoriented and distressed, and he wanted to be within earshot. She wasn't distressed. She woke at 2 in the morning, sniffed the crate door methodically, looked at Grant on the couch, and then put her head back down and went to sleep. He lay there and listened to her breathe and felt something in his chest that he didn't have an accurate word for. Not happiness, exactly. Something more structural than that. Like a beam settling. She healed with a focus that reminded him of the best operators he'd worked with. Methodical, serious, committed to the program without drama. She did her physical therapy exercises. The slow leash walks, the gentle passive range of motion, the cavaletti poles he fashioned from lengths of doweling he had in the garage, with a patience that seemed almost professional. She tolerated the cone. She took her medications wrapped in bits of cheese with a dignity that made it clear. She understood. This was a transaction she was choosing to enter. She also, gradually, became a different dog than the one on the table that first night. Not different in character. Her character had been apparent from the beginning, in the way she'd looked at him in the truck, in the way she'd listened to him talk about the basement and Axis and the sump pump situation, but different in presence. She filled the house in a way he hadn't known the house needed filling. He found himself talking out loud more, narrating, telling her when he was going to the kitchen, when he'd be back, what he was planning to make for dinner. He started cooking actual meals instead of the rotation of deli sandwiches and frozen pasta he'd been running on since Carolyn left. Mostly so he'd have scraps worth giving. The scraps were always approved. She had opinions. He hadn't expected that. Or rather, he'd expected working dog focus without personality, which wasn't how it worked with cattle dogs. She had thoughts about squirrels, profound and consuming thoughts, apparently, about certain trucks that drove past the house, suspicious, about the neighbor's tabby cat, complex feelings, ongoing, and about Grant specifically that she communicated with a directness he found both comical and, quietly, sustaining. She had a habit of pressing her head into his knee when he sat at the kitchen table in the evenings. Not asking for anything, just registering her presence alongside his. He let himself receive it. That was new. Spring came. Biscuit was cleared for longer walks, then off-leash time in the yard, and then, cautiously, under supervision, the field behind the house where the land ran flat toward the mountains. She ran for the first time at the beginning of April, still with a slight hitch in her stride from the repaired leg, but running, actually running, and Grant stood in the field with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched her go and did not try to name what he was feeling because it was too large for a name. His son, Elliot, called in late April. This was less common than Laurel's calls. Elliot was 31, lived in Halifax, worked in something financial, and had inherited from his mother the capacity to be alone without finding it a problem, and from his father a difficulty with small talk that made phone calls between them tend toward the perfunctory. The divorce had been hard on Elliot in ways neither of them had adequately addressed, and there was a period in his mid-20s where calls had stopped entirely, and Grant had driven through that period with music turned off and the particular kind of guilt that doesn't have anywhere to go. Elliot had heard about the dog from Laurel. "So you've got a dog now," he said. "Biscuit," Grant said. 3 or 4 years old, cattle dog mix. She's doing well. A pause. "What happened to her?" Grant told him the full story. The black ice, the sound beneath the porch, the -23. He didn't embellish. He rarely did. When he was done, Elliot was quiet for a moment, then, "That was a good thing you did," Grant said. "I'm not sure I did anything. I just stopped the truck, Dad," Elliot said. "That's sometimes all it is. He didn't know what to do with that. He thanked Elliot. They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing particular. Hockey, a renovation Elliot was doing in his bathroom, something about Halifax traffic. It was the longest they'd talked in 2 years. Neither of them acknowledged this. It didn't seem to need acknowledging. Summer, Grant and Biscuit had settled into a routine with the serious ease of people who've found a thing that works and have no intention of changing it. Up at 5:30, Biscuit wasn't noisy about the mornings, but she was present, sitting at the end of his bed with the calm inevitability of a conclusion already reached. The long walk before the heat settled in. Down the gravel road, through the field, sometimes to the small creek that ran along the property boundary, where Biscuit would wade in past her knees and look back at him with an expression of complete satisfaction. Home by 7, breakfast, hers, then his. He'd started eating real breakfasts, eggs usually. He made them properly, in butter, which Carolyn had always said was excessive, but which seemed to him one of the few culinary positions worth defending. He'd started running into people in a way he hadn't before. It turned out that having a dog made you visible in a town the way simply existing in a town didn't. Neighbors he'd waved at for 2 years stopped to scratch Skit's ears and told him things about themselves. The woman 3 houses down, Meredith, had had a cattle dog years ago, and she and Biscuit had an immediate and mutual affection that resulted in Meredith bringing Grant zucchini from her garden on 3 separate occasions, which he didn't know what to do with. But he made a stir-fry, and it was fine. The man who ran the feed supply on the edge of town, whose name was either Arnold or Harold. Grant had never been certain, had a daughter who fostered dogs, and they had a 15-minute conversation about the provincial rescue system that Grant participated in with genuine interest. He hadn't been genuinely interested in a conversation in a while. It landed differently than he expected. In July, he drove to Calgary for the first time in months. Not for the industrial site. For the veterans drop-in that a former colleague had mentioned twice before Grant had deflected it twice, and then finally, inexplicably, decided to stop deflecting. He'd had no particular intention of talking about himself. He went because it seemed like the sort of thing a person should attempt if they were, as he was cautiously beginning to suspect, attempting to rejoin the world. He sat in a folding chair in a church basement in Inglewood and drank the worst coffee he'd had since the service and listened to men and one woman talk about things he recognized. The flatness after. The way civilian life felt like a badly subtitled version of something in a language you used to speak fluently. The marriages that didn't survive the distance, not just the geographic distance, the other kind, the interior kind, the thing that happened with sound sometimes, in crowds. The particular loneliness of being the person in the room who can identify 14 exits but can't locate the small talk. He didn't talk the first time. He went back the second week and didn't talk then either. The third week, a man his age. A tall Métis man from Red Deer who'd done 2 tours and lost his son to an overdose and now volunteered with a program that paired veterans with therapy animals. Said something that cracked through whatever Grant had been keeping maintained. The man's name was Victor. He said, "The dog doesn't need you to explain yourself. She doesn't need the full story, or the clean version, or the version where you held it together. She just needs you to show up." Grant had heard similar things before. It landed differently now, because he had the evidence. He drove home in the early evening with the light going gold over the foothills and Biscuit in the passenger seat. He'd eventually stopped trying to keep her in the back, with her head out the window and her ears streaming back, and he thought about Axis, and about Lefebvre, who he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, and about Elliot at 31 in Halifax trying to fix his bathroom, and about Laurel's heart emoji on a Thursday morning, and about Carolyn, somewhere. Having finally learned something he should have been learning alongside her. He wasn't sure the word was peace. He'd always distrusted that word, the way people used it like it was a destination rather than a practice. But there was something happening, some low process, some accumulation. He noticed he'd stopped dreading the evenings. He'd stopped monitoring himself for what he wasn't feeling. In September, he got a call from the number for the Nanton shelter that the vet's office had connected him with, back in the beginning, when they were trying to trace Biscuit's history. A woman named Adadaise, who ran the rescue network in the region, said they had a situation. A cattle property east of Clarisholm had surrendered 11 dogs, mix of cattle dogs and labs, and something that might have been a coonhound. And the shelter was full, and she was trying to find experienced fosters who could take 1 or 2 while longer-term placements were arranged. Grant said, "How experienced are you looking for?" Adaze said, "Honestly, someone who's got a stable home and a patient temperament and isn't thrown by dogs that have some behavioral stuff to work through." He looked at Biscuit, who was on the mat by the back door watching a moth with total attention. "I can take 2, he said. Adaze was quiet for a moment. "Really? Temporarily," he said, "unless they work out." He heard her smile through the phone. That's what every foster says. She wasn't wrong. He knew that. He took the 2 dogs. A young lab cross named by the shelter as Murphy, and a nervous cattle dog with 1 blue eye and 1 brown one that Grant started calling Dusk because she calmed visibly in the evenings, something about the change in light. Biscuit managed the introductions with a benevolent authority that suggested she'd always understood herself to be slightly more than just a dog. She taught Murphy to stop stealing from the water bowl by simply blocking him with her body until he waited. She allowed Dusk to sleep against her flank during the first week's thunder, which was more than most dogs would have offered. The 3 of them filled the house in a way that was genuinely too much, objectively, and that Grant found himself not wanting to reduce. He rearranged the furniture again. He finished the basement. Laurel came at Thanksgiving with Patrick and the kids, which was the first time she'd visited since the separation. The kids, Emmett, 9, and Freya, 6, had the precise energy that children have when they are aware they are in the presence of multiple dogs and are trying to contain themselves with the limited success available to their age group. Patrick shook Grant's hand with a warmth that surprised him. Laurel stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the house. The finished walls, the food on the stove, the 3 dogs arrayed around the room in their respective places, and said, quietly, "You've been busy." "A bit," he said. She stayed in the doorway a moment longer. He knew she was doing what people who love you do, taking inventory, trying to locate the thing they've been worried about, checking whether it's still there. He stood at the stove and let her look. He had nothing to hide this time. Or rather, the things there were to hide were the usual ones, the ones everyone carries, and he'd stopped being ashamed of having them. Freya had discovered Biscuit by then and was sitting cross-legged on the floor with Biscuit's chin on her knee, both of them very still. Emmett was trying to teach Murphy to shake, with mixed results. Dusk was watching from behind the couch. "Which one found you?" Laurel asked. He nodded toward Biscuit. She looked at them, Freya, who had her father's quietness and her grandmother's dark eyes, and Biscuit, who had everything she'd had on the table in High River, and was now also, somehow, the one who had organized this whole house into something that functioned. She knew, Laurel said. It wasn't really a question. Grant thought about the drive in the dark, the -23, the weight of a trusting head on his thigh. She gave it a fair chance, he said. He keeps in touch with Adaze now. He's fostered 11 dogs total. He keeps track on a list he wrote on the back of an envelope that he keeps on the fridge. Murphy went to a young couple in Lethbridge who sent occasional photos. Dusk found a placement on a hobby farm outside Pincher Creek, and by all accounts, had transformed into an entirely different animal, one who ran fence lines and herded ducks, and had discovered a personal purpose as substantial as any Grant had known. The others had their own stories, their own trajectories. He didn't follow all of them, because you couldn't. Because that was part of the practice, learning to do the thing fully, and then let the outcome belong to the thing itself. Elliot came in November. He and Grant drove out to the Oldman River and walked with Biscuit in the cold for 2 hours and talked more than they had in years. Not about the important things, mostly, or not directly, but around them, the way men tend to do, which isn't avoidance so much as a different kind of approach. At one point, Elliot skipped a rock across the river, and then they stood there watching the water, and Elliot said, "I'm glad you stopped the truck." Grant said, "Me too." Biscuit had found something in the reeds and was regarding it with extreme professional interest. The mountains were out that day, the full range visible in the autumn clarity, and the light came off the river at that angle it gets in November, low and lateral and the color of old honey. Grant had seen this river before, driven past it, crossed it, noted it. He had not looked at it like this before. He was looking at it now. He's 59 now. The basement is finished. He went to the veterans group for the full fall and is considering continuing in the new year. He spoke twice. The second time he talked about Axis, and about Biscuit, and about the relationship between the two that he's still working out the shape of. Something about purpose and trust and what happens when the mission changes but the instinct doesn't. Victor, the man from Red Deer, nodded the whole way through. He doesn't know what the next years look like. He knows what mornings look like, the gravel road, the field, the creek when the ice hasn't set. He knows what evenings look like, the mat by the back door, the weight against his knee, the breathing that fills the house until the house is not a quiet place anymore but a full one, and he hasn't wanted to fix that, so he hasn't. Biscuit runs now. The hitch is barely there. On the good days, the long days, the clear ones, when the wind is down and the light comes flat and gold from the west, she runs like nothing ever happened to her. Grant watches from the middle of the field, hands in his pockets, the mountains behind him and the dog ahead of him, and all the ordinary enormous distance of the prairies in between. He's working on staying in the middle of it. He thinks he might be getting better at that.